Hey folks, welcome back. As you can see, not much has changed here since the last video, and that's because we're going to jump right in where we left off last week. So the truck starts and it runs, but it needs some tuning. And figured that would be a good opportunity to bring you guys along and show you, the very basics or the ins and outs of mechanical fuel injection. So I'll be taking some of these parts off of the truck and we can disassemble them, look them over, and I can show you how some of this stuff works. But before we get into that, I actually want to tackle the transmission oil coolers. So I'm kind of making a big change from one system to another system, and I'll bring you guys along for that. I'm a little bit short on time this week, so I'm trying to utilize my time the best that I can and do these two projects. I've got my goals set relatively low this week. If I can get the truck tuned up, running to where I'm happy with the idle and all of that stuff, and get it to the point that I can go for a drive in the truck and start tuning, more full throttle stuff, that would be awesome if I could get to that point. Now, before I can actually drive the truck, I need to get a transmission cooler on it, so that's the other part that I'm really shooting for. If I can get those two done, I'll be really happy, and if we happen to get a good day, this day's off, good weather day, we'll go ahead and take this thing for a drive around the block. Now, if I happen to get all of that done and I actually don't get a good day to go for a drive in this thing, I've got a couple other little projects like upper radiator mounts that have changed and stuff like that. We'll tackle them in this video. If not, it is what it is. So let's get started on these tranny coolers. Okay, let's jump right into this transmission cooler. So this one here is the one I'm taking off of the truck. And this is a homemade unit that I built, and I was just kind of trying something out. So this started out as just a piece of aluminum tubing and an extruded transmission cooler. I've never really heard anything great about this particular type of cooler. The way it's supposed to work is you're supposed to mount this cooler in direct airflow, and then you've got inlet and outlet ports. And this is actually divided in half. It has an aluminum divider that runs nearly the full length of the cooler. It stops about this spot here. So your fluid from the transmission or steering, whatever you're using it on, comes in this port, and it has to run the full length of the cooler before it goes around that little diversion or bulkhead in there. And then it has to run the full length of the cooler back to this port here. Like I said, I've never heard anything really great about these, but just the way the whole thing was constructed was going to work well for what I wanted to do. So what I did was I took one of these coolers, lopped the mounts off of the end of it. I machined the outside diameter down to fit very snug inside of this, this size piece of tubing. Once that was done, I machined a few of these fins out in different locations, kind of had it all strategically laid out. That way it would divert the fluid, or not the fluid, but the coolant around this particular cooler. So you've got engine coolant, your antifreeze, coming in this port right here. There's an opening in this tube. It enters the cooler in this location. Then coolant can flow in about the bottom third of this whole unit around this area here. This right here is actually a block heater. So if nothing's running, your fluid is basically just flowing in and circulating because the coolant is being heated up by this element, and it just casually flows through the machined out passages in here and then re-enters the block through these hoses. So this was actually mounted on these useless lower bell housing bolts in a C6. So this was actually the lowest point in the cooling system. So coolant could flow in here, be heated, migrate its way up through back into the engine block, and heat the engine block up. That part of it actually worked really pretty good. Now, as far as a transmission cooler, the way this worked was your electric water pump would force fluid through here along with into the front ports of the engine block. It would enter this cooler here, and it could flow the bottom third, but it would have to go up this side of the cooler. Basically, it would actually have to go up through passages here and here. And then it would have to travel the length of this center portion of the cooler before it could re-enter in the top third of it. So your coolant's coming in and it's making this route this way. And then you've got your transmission fluid coming in and making a route this way internally. And that's just basically how the whole cooler worked. The reason I did that was this was originally intended to be a mud truck. And there's nothing more of a pain in the butt to wash than stuff with fins, like a fluid to air transmission cooler or a radiator, something of that nature. So as you can see here, there's nowhere that mud can build up that's actually going to affect the cooling capabilities of this unit. The reason I'm going away from it is, if you remember way back when we first started talking about building an engine, both of my blocks that I'm using now are hard blocked. And by hard blocking those engines, I've eliminated the passages that I was using to return the coolant back into the cooling system. Now, rather than just build longer hoses and run this stuff clear up to the top of the radiator or something like that, that stuff, it kind of gets messy. And since it's not intended to be a mud truck really anymore. I've had this cooler sitting in the shed for many years. I used it for a short time on the buggy, and I actually ended up changing that one to dual coolers that were smaller. So I've had this one kicking around, and I thought it might be good for this application. I've always pronounced that derail, but I see people lately are referring to this as deraily or something like that. I don't know, I think we'll just call it a Dale cooler, because clearly the E and R are silent. So I've had this Dale cooler sitting in the shed for many years. Still had the part number on the box. I looked it up, and they still make it, fortunately. So I ordered a second one. It's supposed to be the same cooler. So let's open this thing up and we'll take a look at that. Well, it looks like outside of an updated sticker that they put on upside down and some slotted holes for those that can't measure a bolt pattern, it looks like pretty much the exact same cooler. So we're in business there. I think dual coolers is a really good idea. It seems to be pretty common practice in the monster truck world. On top of that, if I have a problem with one of these coolers, say something gets jammed up through one of them or you spring a leak, I could always, do a little bit of moving around with some cooling lines, at least have one cooler still functioning and get me through a show or maybe even a weekend. As far as mounting these coolers, that should be pretty straightforward. I still have the original mounting tabs in the front of the chassis where the original radiator was mounted. So it should be as simple as building an aluminum plate that will bolt into the chassis and catch these bolt holes on the coolers. And at least it will be easy to get this pair of coolers in the chassis, and then I can start figuring out wiring and plumbing. I'm going to go ahead and employ the CNC router to do all the hard work and just get started on it. Well, I got this mount all done up. After it was finished on the CNC table, I went ahead and did a clear powder coat on it. I think it turned out pretty good. So now all I got to do is bolt the coolers on it. Well, here's pretty much the final piece. Got both the coolers bolted onto the mounting plate there. Got my jumper hose built. The other hoses from the transmission will hook to these fittings here. Now this is only 1/8 inch aluminum, but by bolting this whole cooler assembly in here really makes it pretty rigid, with the exception of this center area here. It was kind of a little floppy, so I went ahead and built these strut rods that bolt into place, and that makes that thing really pretty rigid. I also went ahead and installed some Deutz plugs on the end of the fan wiring. So I have a switched power wire in the harness that runs right by this area here. So getting power to these is going to be really simple. That's not going to be a problem at all. The only thing I have left now is to wrestle this thing up in the chassis and get it bolted into place. Well, there it is, easy peasy. Getting that in there was a little bit of a challenge just because it's hard to reach both sides, but we got her sorted out. It pretty well bolted right in, no problems there. It's really pretty rigid. The only thing left now is to get the plumbing done. Now the easy cheesy way to do it would be to just run a couple of hydraulic hoses from just ahead of that bulkhead plate that the transfer case is bolted into. There's plenty of objects to zip tie it to and, you know, get the fluid back and forth up through here. But as you can see, there's really not much for hydraulic or hoses anywhere in this thing. So I don't know, I'm kind of torn. Do I, congest the area more with more stainless hardline, or just throw some hydraulic hoses in here and get the job done? I don't know, I got a little bit of time. I am extremely low on 3/8 stainless steel hardline, so I need to consider that. I think what I'm going to do is grab my little rolly stool, pull it over here, and have a think about it for a little bit. Maybe I can come up with a plan. Now, I don't know if this is going to work very good or not, but I'm going to attempt to show you how I get this 37-degree flare in this tubing, what tool I use, and just in general how a guy goes about doing this. So to start with, this is a 37-degree flare in this tube, which works in conjunction with an 37-degree AN fitting. I believe it also works with JIC, no problem. I've used it before without any issues. So the tool that I use is this Gould Imperial Eastman tubing kit, and it's a number 400-F, and it comes with, my kit came with a 402F reaming and deburring tool. So that's where we're going to start.
I've already cut my tubing and cleaned up the end a bit, just make sure it's flat and square, and then I actually used a reamer and my drill over there just to touch it up a little. This is 3/8 tube, which in AN world would be number 6. And basically, I'm just going in here loosely because I'm going to use the reaming tool, the reaming and deburring tool, to start with. I think it's probably designed to have the correct taper to get things started. And this I just do by hand. I don't worry about putting anything in the vise. Just snug it up there. And you can run this down. This collar right here is threaded, obviously, as you can see. Threads into the tool. It's a very fine thread, so you can snug it down there. And then you just turn this handle here. Seems pretty basic, right? So all you're doing is making sure there are no burrs on the end of that tube, and then I believe that taper is probably really pretty important for starting your flare correctly. Just a little general cleanup there.
Now, back to the number 6 hole. And we'll set this aside for now. Well, let's do this first. This is really, really important. Do not forget to put this stuff on in the correct order. You're going to want your B-nut and your collar here. You're really angry if you forget to put that stuff on first and then you flare your tube. Especially a piece of tubing that is already bent and just needing that last flare and that last nut. Let's set this off to the side. It's ready to go.
So these tools are actually designed to be clamped in the vise. You can see you grab onto that. And I'm going to grab my stool so that I can sit down and hopefully you guys can see what's going on. Now you've got this little unit that swings in and out, and it's got little numbers stamped in there for your size of tubing. And if you look, you can see this little spacer here is slightly taller than that spacer there. And once we get going, you'll probably understand how these two work. Basically, you're going to slide your tube in here, in the tube holder, and I like to run it up just to the flaring portion. Just don't even snug that up. As a matter of fact, you can see I can still move it. I'm going to push this unit here in to where this nut, when I thread it down, it's going to stop on that little spacer there. And as I'm doing that, it's pushing the tube down in this clamp here. And that's basically, that's where they want you to set that depth. So just before I get to the stopper, I like to give it just a little bit. And once it stops, once it hits that stopper, you go ahead and tighten this down to lock your tube in place. Now move this stop out of the way, and you start rolling this around. And this flare actually has 3 rollers, and it does a really nice job flaring that tubing. So you just roll it around with your wrench. I don't know if you can see that thing flaring the tubing or not, but it's going to stop as you bottom out on the threads. See there, I've stopped. So it's gone down and flared that tube as much as it's going to. And if you can see, there's a pin. You can lift this nut that turns it. That pin drives this threaded portion down. Now, you lift this up and you turn this backwards 1 turn. And all you're doing is actually turning your flare and your rollers and everything. You're turning it, and it's what they call burnishing this flare. So you turn it 1 turn, and then let that pin drop back down so it can drive the threads out and go ahead and back the flaring portion of this tool back out. And while everything's still in the vise, you can go ahead, unlock your tube from the clamp. This folds out of the way.
So you can pull the tubing out. And there you go. You have a nice, clean flare. Well, I'm not too sure I like the POV video on this flare in this tube, so I'm going to go ahead and do it again and explain it again. Maybe both parts will make the video. I don't really know. So sometimes making videos is just kind of challenging. So what I'm doing right here is I am going to deburr the tubing with the deburring tool. You can see right here. Just lock that unit down, just hand tight. Actually, I'm going to do like in the POV video. I'm going to go ahead and just snug it up just a little bit with my wrench. Snug down this threaded collar until the cutter portion of the deburring tool makes contact with the tube. And go ahead and just turn the handle. And we're going to cut the burr out of the inside of that tube by doing that. And if this taper on the deburring tool is in fact important to how the taper of this starts that flare, I guess it's a good thing I'm doing it this way. All right, that's probably clean enough. Deburred good enough. Drop the tube out far enough to get the deburring tool out of the way. Now we want to set this up so that the height of this tool sticking out of the clamp, the tube vise, whatever we want to call it, is at the correct height. That is very critical, very important. So this little deal here swings in and out, and there is a stopper on each side of this arm. So if you swing it in, this taller stopper is for number 8 and number 10 tube, which that would be 1/2 inch and 5/8 tubing. This shorter one is good for number 3 all the way to number 6. So everything from 3/16 to 3/8 tubing. We're doing 3/8 tubing, so we're going to swing it around this way so that I'm using this shorter little stopper nub sticking up there. So I'm going to push the tube right up to the rollers by hand. I've barely got any tension on here. It's really not clamped in there at all. And I'm just going to turn this nut, which turns these threads, which is driving those 3 tapered rollers down towards the tube. But since the tube is not clamped, all I'm doing is pushing the tube down in the vise. And I'm going to do that. Just keep pushing that tube down until I hit this stopper on this little arm that swings in and out. And I like to go down just to where it almost touches the stopper, give it just a little bit of a snug by hand, and then finish until it touches the stopper. So all I've done is threaded this down. I've touched the little stop nubbin. Go ahead and lock the tube in place in the tube clamp. Make sure to swing this thing out of your way. And like I said before, if the POV part of the video makes it into the end deal here, make sure that you get your B-nut and your sleeve on here before you flare it. So it's not going to go on after you're done, that's for sure. So we've got this arm swung out of the way, and we're going to go ahead and turn this nut, which is driving the threaded portion and your taper rollers, down into the tube. Now, normally this would be done in a smooth flowing motion, but somebody put their camera right in the way of the wrench. Genius. Now I've threaded it down until the threaded portion stops in the threads. So we've gone down the correct depth on this flare. As you can see in there, as I was turning it, those tapered rollers in there were just flaring that tube out like so. Now, we have to pick this nut up. See if I can show you guys. What I'm doing is picking this up, and it's lifting a pin out of a little drive dog. And according to the instructions, you turn this 1 rotation backwards with that lifted up. Now, as you're turning it backwards, all it's doing is rotating those rollers in this flare without lifting the rollers back out of the tube. And they refer to that as burnishing the taper. Now, you make 1 rotation, you drop that pin back in the drive slot there, then you can go ahead and back your tapered rollers out of the flare of the tube. Go ahead and loosen up the tube clamp. And there you go. Nice 37-degree flare in your hardline. Hopefully I got one of these on video good enough to make sense. There are actually some really good videos on YouTube on how to use this tool. That's where I learned to do all of this, was just YouTube tutorials. Worked awesome. The first couple times you do it, it might be a little bit overwhelming, but it's not hard to do this. And you get a project like this where you do, I don't know, there's probably 40 flares on this truck. And once you get done doing a dozen of them, there's really nothing to it. The tool itself is relatively expensive, I think. I got this one on eBay, and I thought it was a really good deal because it come with the flaring tool and the deburring tool. But if you're going to do very much hardline work, I recommend this tool for sure. One last thing on the tubing and this flaring stuff. When you flare this tube, this edge gets really, really sharp. And what I like to do is just take a little green Scotch-Brite, red Scotch-Brite, whatever you got on hand, and just clean that edge up just a little bit. Don't worry about getting in there on the taper or the sealed portion of the seat, nothing like that. Just knock that edge off on here. Because those things they're rude sharp. That is much better, and it doesn't take much effort to do that. So now what I'll do is I'll go over, blast a little carb cleaner, brake clean, whatever I got laying around here. Make sure that tube is clean. It doesn't matter if you're building hydraulic hoses, soft lines, hard lines. Make sure your tubing is clean when you're done. That is probably the second most important step after making sure you have these two pieces on there. All right, now we're gonna have to build a holder so I can have both ends of this setup supported. All right, so now what I'm gonna do is fish this hardline assembly up into the chassis. I had this bracket built. I actually had some hard lines run up to the transmission cooler in the radiator when the radiator was up front. I had this bracket that basically it clamps onto the hard line for the power steering, and I'm trying to utilize that. It's got a couple of AN bulkhead fittings. I'm trying to sneak these hard lines up in between the steering hard lines and the throttle cable. Some pyro lines, or wires, excuse me. Get everything in place here. It'll be really clean, I think, if I can get it all in there and put together right. So this hard line just clamps to another hard line. This bracket actually clamps to the steering hard line. I'll get it snugged up in place. Maybe. Of course, it's backwards. Oh yeah, much better. I know you guys can't see what I'm doing here, but I'll show you when I get it done. There, I've got that bracket locked in place. These lines are just running right up alongside this power steering cooler here. Another one of those extruded aluminum coolers that I told you never really heard anything great about it. But it'll work. It'll work for power steering on this truck, that's for sure. And they just sneak right on past up here, dog over and up and over these steering lines here. And the plan is to build a bracket, another aluminum bracket, that I can put some bulkhead fittings in that these lines will hook to. That bracket will clamp onto the frame right here, onto this chassis tube, hold them in place steady, and then the other side of that bulkhead tube, I can hook flex line or hoses to this side and run up to the coolers right there. Simple enough. Get a couple of measurements, go draw it up on plasma cam and convert it over to a CNC path for the Shapeoko and let it go to work. Here's that bracket that I just installed. Just got a couple of bulkhead fittings and a chunk of aluminum, and it clamps to that hard line, a couple of 1/4-inch bolts. So we'll do something similar to that up front, only instead of clamping it to another hard line, we're going to clamp it to the chassis. After a little manual machining and some cleanup, here's what the finished part looks like. Obviously it came off the CNC machine in 2 pieces. Had to drill and tap this hole and countersink it in the Bridgeport. So now basically this just clamps this whole bracket onto the chassis. Then I can use a couple of bulkhead fittings and be able to hook those hardlines up. Should be pretty straightforward. There's that bracket bolted in place. So now this end of my hardlines are supported as they should be. You know, had I had any idea whatsoever that this truck was going to have transmission coolers at the front of the chassis, I probably would have done a tab off of that tube, fished the hard lines through this hole in this floor cross member here, and then another tab right here on the front of the firewall. That would have been way easier to do. But you know, for this whole setup right here being a complete afterthought, I'm not disappointed with how it turned out. I can live with that for sure. The last thing that I need to do as far as plumbing goes is a couple of short jumper hoses from those bulkhead fittings down to the transmission, and these bulkhead fittings here up to the transmission coolers right here. That'll be pretty easy to do. I've got fittings here on hand and some hose, so I'm going to get busy and get those done real quick. I finally got this transmission cooler project pretty well wrapped up. Got both my Dale transmission coolers all mounted up. As you've seen previously, they're both plumbed in. I don't know if you can see there, I was able to tie into that harness right there. There was a wire going to the front of the chassis that was actually going to be used for the windshield washer fluid pump. So it's a big 14 gauge wire that's on a fused relay circuit controlled by a switch. I just pulled it back here to this first opportunity to drag it out of the harness. Put a couple Deutz plugs on it, built a little harness to go to each fan. That pretty much took care of the electrical. A couple of flex hoses to tie into the hard lines. And then back there in the back, I'll just walk around over there and show you what I got going on there. I was able to mount a bypass style oil filter to that bulkhead cross-member transfer case mount, and then plumb it in so that I have an external oil filter for the transmission. That'll come in handy. You know, it's kind of nice to just throw a filter on there once in a while. Also, a guy can take that filter, cut it apart, remove a portion of the element, squeeze the oil out of it, and kind of maybe check in on the health of the transmission. That's always a good idea if you have anything that has a pressurized oil system. So anyway, we're going to call the cooler done. I just want to jump in here real quick. After I had started editing this video together, I found out that I got way more content than I was planning on getting this days off. As you can tell, I've already sped up some of this video here and still ended up with over a half an hour. Just a rough guess of what I've got on the mechanical fuel injection side of it. I easily have over an hour's worth of footage there that I need to muddle my way through and put something together. So there was potential to end up with probably an hour and a half long video, and I really don't want to do that. So what I've decided to do is go ahead and split this video into two parts. Go ahead and end this video right here, and then I'll pick up on the mechanical fuel injection in the next video. This actually works out better so that, you know, I'm not burying some good technical information on the fuel injection portion with regular old, you know, fabrication and building that I've done here with transmission coolers. I did end up accomplishing my goals this days off, and this truck did actually pull out of the shop. And I know that the casual foreshadowing trend hasn't been a thing for a month or so now, but for those of you that are still following along, here's a little footage of this thing running and driving out of the shop. And keep your eyes open for the mechanical fuel injection portion of this video, because it's only going to be a couple of days to put something together there, and I'll probably get it posted up before the end of the week.